Welcome to another edition of Russian History with Dr. Brovkin. Today, I'd like to speak about Ukraine. In 2022, there was 30 years of independence, and this is a good time to look at the development of Ukraine before the war with Russia in 2022, so that we could have a kind of a balance sheet where Ukraine was in 2022 after 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. There are two ways and two major theses. One is that it's a democracy, and this is in the view of President Biden, who says that there is a democracy, which is Ukraine, and then there is an autocracy and tyranny, which is Putin's Russia. And then there are others who are more critical voices, and they come mostly from Ukraine itself. And you'll hear a lot of this discussion today that suggests exactly the opposite, that Ukraine is a dictatorship, and that in many indicators of its politics and economy and society, it is a failed state. So what follows next is a survey of data that we have on the development of Ukraine from 1992. Now, the first would be a survey of the 1990s, and that is the politics and economy in the 1990s. 1990s in Ukraine were very similar to Russia, which is now known as the terrible years. It was a transition to post-Soviet system, and indeed there are many parallels. It was all a matter of privatization, rise of oligarchs, rise of criminality, pauperization, which means increasing poverty of the population. And this was almost identical. There's hardly any difference at all if one were to compare 1990s in Ukraine and in Russia. To start with, Ukraine had a population in 1991 of 52 million people. It was a highly developed part of the Soviet Union. It had many of industries such as metallurgy. It was producing steel. It was a grain basket like the rest of southern Russia. Lots of grain. It produced cars. There was a bus factory in Lvov. In Nikolaev there was a shipyard, and it produced its own airplanes, an aviation industry of Antonov company that produced the biggest airplanes in the world for transport purposes. It still is. Now, so it was a highly industrialized country of 52 million people, and the expectation was that it would become kind of like another France at this time. Now, as a result of privatization in both countries, in Russia and in Ukraine, the results were pathetic. There was very similar results, which means that a bunch of oligarchs pretty much divided up all the industry between themselves, both in Russia and in Ukraine. No difference at this point. In Ukraine, the geography is such that the most nationalistic parts of the country are in the west, and the most rich industrial and agricultural parts of the country are in the south and east. And that means that the oligarchs were in control of the territories where the factories are, which is along the Dnieper River and in Donetsk, in Donbas area, which produces coal and metal and all kinds of things. So there were clans of oligarchs that controlled major industry, and politics basically had nothing to do with democracy, but it had to do with the struggle of clans for power and influence. And so one clan would replace another in power, and it would appear like there were presidential elections and let one president change another, but in fact it was redivision of property between the major oligarchs. The two famous names is Mr. Kolomoisky, who is by nationality Jewish, and Mr. Akhmetov, who is by nationality Tatar. And there are several other ones. So, by 1999, the GDP of Ukraine diminished to 40% of 1991 level. In other words, more than half of it disappeared. At the same time, about 8 million Ukrainians or citizens of Ukraine left the country in search of better life elsewhere. Similar process going on in Russia as well. A lot of people left Russia at that time as well. So of the Ukrainians, several million came to Russia, and many of them stayed. I think 3 or 4 million, and 3 or 4 million went to Poland, and a few others went to other parts of Europe. So, as I mentioned, political system was a redivision of wealth and power. And so if you follow in great detail what happened when one president changed another, you could see that one of them was promoted as son-of-law to control several banks and several key industries. And then when he would be out of power, then all of that would disappear. In other words, a presidency went with the redivision of wealth, and this is what is different. Now the Ukraine begins to be very different from Russia in the early 2000s, because Putin put control over the oligarchs. Not so in Ukraine. In Ukraine, it continued to be that the presidency is in the hands of the oligarchs. That's the political system in Ukraine, in the hands of the oligarchs. Now they redivide property, but then there were specifics, and that is that at first the President Kuchma, because of this catastrophic decline of production and everything, had this orientation towards Russia. And in 2004, Russia and Ukraine concluded a treaty which was signed on the United Economic Area, which was pretty much a free trade zone. Now that, of course, generated panic in those circles in Ukrainian society that wanted a Western orientation, and with great help from America, they staged the so-called color revolution, and a new president came to power, Yushchenko. And the Russians were quite willing to work with him as well, and they offered him all kinds of cheap gas prices and other deals in order to retain Ukraine in this sphere of influence of possible cooperation. But the problem was that in 2008 there was a huge economic crisis in the United States that pulled all Europe with it, and there was simply no money for Ukraine. And economic situation deteriorated drastically in those years. I think the figures is that after 2008 it was a 25% collapse of Ukrainian industry, which in turn led to a revival of forces that wanted to take a pro-Russian economic orientation. But there was a continued problem with economic performance of Ukraine, and there are several reasons for this, which I will now explain in this segment on economics. Now, the facts are that year after year, Ukrainian industry was shrinking. And for example, the Zaporozhye car factory finally closed down in 2018. The Nikolaev shipbuilding yard, which used to build huge ships and military ships for the Soviet Union, it finally closed down in 2021. The Antonov Aviation, which is a big company that used to produce the biggest aircraft in the world, did not produce a single airplane from 2010 to 2019. In other words, most of these industries collapsed. The question is why? Well, I provide the answer in my article, and there'll be a reference to it, which is called Making Money, Moving Money, Parking Money Overseas, which applied actually in the 1990s the same way to Russia as it did in Ukraine. The point is that the oligarchs make more money by moving their assets to the West, stripping their assets in Russia or in Ukraine and moving money and parking money overseas. In other words, they're not the kind of entrepreneurs who want to improve production inside their country. They'd rather rip it up and move their assets to Western banks. So this is one problem. And it's the same thing in Russia as it was in Ukraine, except Putin put an end to it in Russia in 2003, and in Ukraine it continued. The second reason, and a more serious reason for continued deindustrialization of Ukraine, is that Ukrainian production has no market in the West. Nobody needs Zaporozhye little teeny weeny cars that they produce. They're not, possibly cannot compete with BMW and other manufacturers of cars in the European Union. Even shipyards are not compatible because they cannot compete with the Western ones or the Chinese ones. Lvov bus company stopped, even though it used to produce buses for the whole Soviet Union, because nobody needs Ukrainian buses in Ukraine. In other words, Ukrainian problem is that its industrial output has no market in the West and has no customers in the West. It cannot compete with Western counterparts. And therefore, it was just degenerating until it all fell into pieces and collapsed. The third reason is the capital flight and the brain flight, which means that all young people essentially go and look for employment in the West. And this is a general problem, not just for Ukraine, but for the Baltics as well, which just has a catastrophic decline of population since independence, and also for countries like Romania and Bulgaria, where young people who have any talent or any education, they go to Germany, they go to Brussels, they seek employment where they pay more in West European countries, and that means continued spiral of decline in their own countries. In other words, EU membership for these countries is not necessarily an asset, and in many cases it's a disaster, as it was the case in Ukraine. There was an article published that's called War and Theft, and that actually is devoted to a period after 2022. But the point it makes, and this is in Oakland Institute, is that the Western investors took over for cheap lots and lots of Ukrainian assets. They did the same thing in Russia too, but it was put under control by Putin. And that means that a company like BlackRock owns more than 28% of Ukrainian arable land. In other words, Ukrainian peasants got nothing, and anything that's of any value went to the ownership of Western companies. And that they became the largest landholders in Ukraine. Now, so the trends in politics and in industry, as I have identified, were increasing control by the Americans of both politics and government. Capital flight, industry collapse, population decline from 52 million people to 45 million people in 2014. And in 37 million people 2019, 37 million before the war started, and now estimates are, because another 10 million left, is about 28 million people. Now, but this is not all. This is just economy and government. Now let me look at the political effects and the life of society, especially concerning Ukrainian people who suffer immensely, as the Russians did in the 1990s. So the Human Rights Report, and I refer here to, you can open it up if you don't believe me, it's called the State Department, United States State Department Report on Human Rights 2023. This is where this information comes from. And it's subdivided into several categories, and one of them is called human rights. So the report describes disappearances, and they've counted 26,000 disappearances in since 2014. One of Russia's war correspondents today is Yuri Podolaka, and he once recalled his story. He's from Sumy, a town in northern Ukraine, that his friends told him that he better get away before it's too late, and otherwise they would have captured him and killed him. So these kind of reprisals were typical, especially the beginning of the war. But I'd like to focus on Ukraine before the war. And the examples cited in this report are all before 2022. Disappearances is one of the categories. In other words, is abuses of security services, torture, sexual abuse, official and unofficial centers of detention, and that is from the State Department report. Arbitrary arrest and detentions. Hundreds of people are detained without any due procedure and are kept in official or unofficial centers for detention. Now, on top of that, there are restrictions on political expression and on the media. I often, almost every day, I listen to Olesya Medvedeva, and she runs a program called Strana, which is Strana UA, which is Ukraine, and she is banished from Ukraine. She cannot broadcast from Ukraine, even there's absolutely nothing against Ukraine in her broadcast, just a survey of Ukrainian politics. Arestovich, the former advisor to Zelensky, he is no longer in Ukraine. He's sort of like trying to be an opposition figure in Western Europe. In other words, there's no political freedom in Ukraine. By any definition, what is going on there is a dictatorship where elections were cancelled, where political police is under no one's control, and essentially Ukraine is a failed state. And I mind you, all of this is before the war started in 2022. That's all. Thank you very much, and I hope you continue to subscribe and write your interesting comments. I'm going to reorganize my playlists so that would be easier accessible by topic. And all of the videos on Ukraine war and Ukraine will be in a separate category. But at this point, thank you very much. Goodbye.